Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this week's class. Our lesson today is Kingdoms and Trading States of Africa. It is your textbook part 3, lesson number 5, and this is going to be our second discussion of the lesson. You can find this lesson on your textbook page number 35. Lesson objectives include that students must be able to know that how powerful West African kingdoms they control the rich Saharan trade routes. This is what we have been discussing in last week's class. And the second objective is that you must be able to know how the Indian Ocean trade routes led to the growth of wealthy city-states along the East African coast. This is what we are going to be focusing in today's lesson. This week's lesson actually focuses about the Eastern kingdoms, particularly the present-day Ethiopia, which was at that time called Axum. But before we start discussion about Axum, just let's have a quick review of the last week's lesson. You remember that we have been discussing that there were three major kingdoms that emerged in the Western Saharan Africa, which was first of them was Ghana. That decline, it was followed by the kingdom of Mali, and at the decline of Mali, the kingdom of Songhai emerged. These three kingdoms, they were important forces at their times, and they controlled, they had a monopoly over the trade routes of West Africa. Particularly, the trade items were gold and salt and ivory and other cereal products. Then we also discussed last week that to the northeastern corner of African continent was Egyptian civilizations. Egypt was a crossroad of different civilizations passing through. The trade was one of the important linking bridge between Egypt and other civilizations. So Egypt brought different cultures to Africa. To the south of Egypt was Nubia, which is present-day Sudan, and for time to time, Egyptians and Nubians they have been fighting. Egyptians tried their best to bring Nubia under their permanent control, but every time they were defeated back after some time of their invasion. But ultimately, Nubia declined, and the kingdom that took over Nubia was the kingdom of Axum. Now, for example, here the book says that by the time the kingdom of Axum conquered Nubia about 350 AD, Axum itself had been a great and important trading center because it was located in a strategic location. Axum actually linked the trade routes of Africa to India and the Mediterranean world. As we just discussed that to the north it was Egypt, and across the Egypt it was the European world that traded with Egypt, and ultimately they traded with the kingdom of Axum. At the same time, kingdom of Axum had its territorial control in the Arabian Peninsula. Particularly Yemen was its territory, so it developed links with the Indian trade routes, because you remember that we discussed that Indian and Chinese and Malayan traders they brought their commodities, they brought their products in Yemen, from where they took these products to Damascus. From Damascus, these items were either sold to European merchants, or either they were sold to Egyptian merchants. So because Yemen itself was under the influence, or you can say under the control of Nubian kingdom, so Nubia had the chance to adopt or to interact with the Indian or with the Malayan or with Chinese cultures, to learn from them or to exchange ideas with them. So the kingdom of Axum became powerful, and it became Christianized in around 300 AD, because Romans were the people who brought Christianity here through Egypt. Because first Egypt became Christianized, and from Egypt Christianity spread into Axum. However, with the arrival of Islam, the power of Axum declined, and because Islam spread not only in Axum or the areas around the Axum, but also in other parts of the areas in African continent. By this way, once Islam spread surrounding the Axum kingdom, it became like an island of Christianity. So, because all the areas around the Axum were dominated by the religion of Islam, but Axum itself remained a dominant Christian nation or Christian society. So once the Axum declined, some other small trading states, or you can say city-states, uh, they emerged along the East African coast. Like important cities were Mombasa and Malindi, which were present-day Kenya and Tanzania, and they were busy trade routes, and the trade continued with India and the eastern flank of the world. So traders, they visited the coast and they exchanged their items, but they did not try to go into deep interior of the African continent. But the cultural amalgamation took place on these important city posts, from where the culture actually gradually spread to other parts of the African continent. So both Arab and Persian merchants set up Muslim communities under the local African rulers in these areas, particularly Mombasa and Malindi, which are now present-day Kenya and Tanzania. By 1000 AD, port cities were actually having a busy trade links and busy trade going on all through the Indian Ocean. So this was important about the Axum, which was one of the most powerful, you can say, and most dominant kingdom in the eastern flank of the African continent. Moving on to the next topic, we enter now about the societies that developed into the Africa during the medieval age. So let's move on to the next slide. Here the book says that Africa's actually had a diverse climate, diverse geography. There were small human communities scattered from place to place, and all these communities had actually their genuine or their indigenous cultures, as well as you can say religious beliefs. So all these communities actually, with the passage of time, they perfected their culture and they perfected their religious belief, even though you can say even today Africa's you can say local communities, or you can say tribal communities, they are the communities that have preserved their original culture even today. And you can see if on different movies or on different channels that and the local religions are being practiced all over Africa. So African societies, they remain isolated due to its you can say least explored geography and least explored topography. But while they developed in isolation, they developed their own you can say specific cultural aspect. So here the book says that factors such as Africa's varied geography, diverse climate, and later migration and trade played major roles in shaping up the early societies of the continent. In medieval Africa, medieval mean the Middle Ages. One is modern age, which is the present age, and one is the classical or the early age, very ancient age. So the medieval ages, the Middle Ages. So the societies of the Middle Ages, they developed into a nuclear family. Nuclear family is a kind of family where the parents and the children, they live together. Parents, they actually bear the central role. They actually hold the central figure within the family, and while other communities while in other communities the family included several generations. So basically nuclear family is your first circle, and Africa's cultures developed that the family system was based on the inner circle. So this is how the nuclear family system developed in the medieval African societies. Political patterns varied from place to place. Every community had its own political pattern. Chief tribal leaders, they were the leaders of the entire community, sometimes a clan, sometimes a small family member group. So it depended from place to place, it varied from place to place. Another important thing is that the religious beliefs, they were also very much diverse and complex throughout Africa. And even today, they are very much diverse. Some of the Africans, they followed the traditional local beliefs and they are polytheists. Polytheists mean a person who believes in more than one god or many gods. So many of the African local cultures, they believe in polytheism. They practice polytheism. Whereas the Christian, even they are, whether they are the North African Christians, whether they are the West African or the South African, once they became Christianized, they also followed the belief of monotheism. It says that around 1000 AD, Christianity and Islam spread across Africa, and the local religions, they were very much in effect, and they were replaced by these two dominant religions across Africa. One thing that is being discussed here is that how the history of Africa moved on from generations to generations, or how the culture shifted from one generation to another. Uh, for culture, it is easy to shift from one generation to the other generation as the beliefs are held by the next generation. They follow the same uh, life patterns as once one they what they see to their parents and grandparents doing. So they follow the same life pattern. But actually, the history moved on throughout the generations in the form of Croats, which means that there were professional storytellers that actually related the stories of past generations to their next generation. So it was not in the form of written shape, whether it was an oral literature which moved on from generation to generation through Groids, or you can say the professional storytellers. This is all about the African continent. So the summary of the lesson is that there were three major kingdoms in the West Africa that emerged: the Kingdom of Ghana, Kingdom of Mali, and Kingdom of Songhai. They controlled the trade routes. In the north flank, there was the Egyptian civilization. Then there were Nubians and Axum. They were the important points for the trade and civilization and culture spread. And then the trade in the eastern edge of the continent actually helped to create the modern cities of like Malindi and Mombasa. And the important point to note is that the system of family that developed in African societies was the nuclear family, where the parents maintained their control or they remained dominant within the family. And the history of the African past societies, or you can say past generations, was uh, transferred to the new generations through Groids, or you can say professional storytellers. I hope you will be able to understand the lesson. Next week we will come back with the new lesson. Until that time, see you.